The Galactic Council chamber pulsed with ceremonial lights, forming spirals across the vaulted ceiling as if the room were preparing for a celebration instead of a declaration of war. Representatives from 100 species leaned forward, eager to witness the moment humanity would finally be humbled. Their whispers built a layered hum, predictions of panic, scrambling pleas, frantic diplomacy. That was how every species behaved when the council announced judgment. Everyone except the man who stood at the center. Ambassador Relon adjusted the cuff of his simple gray suit, the only human in a hall designed to intimidate visitors. The dais was deliberately raised high above him, ringed by armed honor sentinels. The air was deliberately chilled to make non-thermoregulated beings shiver. Every detail existed to remind him that humanity was small, new, inexperienced. Instead, he carried the rested energy of someone waiting for a bus. Grand Speaker Thauroth rose, his multi-toned voice vibrating across the chamber. He announced the motion with all the pomp the council could muster. The words echoed with manufactured gravity. For unchecked expansion, for refusal to submit to council guidance, for destabilizing the ancient balance, Terran civilization is hereby declared an enemy to the galaxy. Gasps rippled. A few species celebrated openly. Others expected begging to begin any second. The council's collective gaze trained itself on Relon, ready to savor the expression of fear that always came next. But Relon didn't flinch. He didn't stiffen. Instead, he opened the small black briefcase beside him and withdrew something that froze the entire assembly. A paper newspaper. Thin, soft-creased, printed. Physical. Antiquated. Untranslatable as a gesture. It wasn't a data slab, not a smart scroll, not a diplomatic tablet. It was nothing the council could classify as a sanctioned communication device. And yet it was something worse, a casual object in a moment designed to be sacred. Relon unfolded it with an unhurried flick, the sound crisp enough to cut through the chamber's artificial hum. Sentinels hesitated, unsure whether the object was a weapon or an insult. Officials whispered in alarm. A few speculated it must be some encoded threat, some hidden technology, some psychological tactic. Others whispered more fearfully. Only a species unconcerned with consequences would act so casually at the moment of a war declaration. Relon scanned a headline, ignoring the sea of eyes locked onto him. He flipped the page, the soft rustle loud enough to feel intentional. Grand Speaker Thauroth narrowed his eyes, more unsettled by the silence in the human's posture than by any defiant speech. Several ministers leaned toward their consoles as military updates trickled in. Terran border defenses had gone dark minutes earlier. Long-range scanners reported missing ship signatures. Analysts began sending emergency memos. Human fleet patterns inconsistent with defensive retreat. A rare tremor entered the council's practiced tone. One of the senior strategists whispered, "Why is he reading? What does he know?" Relon continued reading. Not once did he lift his eyes. A counselor with 3 mandibles clacked anxiously. "Human! Did you understand the declaration? You are at war." Relon turned another page. That tiny, careless act hit harder than any shouted defiance. Species built entire intimidation doctrines around posture, scent, psychic pressure, or vocal resonance. Humans, apparently, used indifference. The chamber couldn't comprehend it. "What is the meaning of this behavior?" demanded a Zyantari representative, half rising from his seat. Relon finally spoke, voice soft enough that the amplifiers strained to carry it. "Sorry, were you finished?" The question wasn't sarcastic. It was casual. That terrified them more. He folded one corner of the paper down, still not meeting their eyes. "You just declared war on a civilization you've never actually seen up close. Thought you might want to sit with that for a moment." The hall's temperature seemed to drop. A murmur threaded through the tiers as officials cross-referenced the growing stream of military anomalies. Missing fleets. Silent outposts. Sensor disruptions. The council had expected a frightened reaction, not tactical confirmation that something vast was already unfolding beyond their control. Relon flipped another page, tone light. "You sure you want to do this?" The question wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple inquiry from someone holding knowledge the chamber didn't possess. And because he spoke without urgency, without raising his voice, without even lowering the newspaper, the council felt something it had never felt before when confronting a younger species. Doubt. The kind that didn't come from being challenged, but from realizing too late that they might have stepped into a conflict vastly beyond their understanding. Relon resumed reading. The rustle of paper echoed like a countdown. Council security channels lit up with frantic alerts as the chamber tried to maintain its composure. While Relon calmly turned another page of the newspaper, status updates streamed into the consoles of senior strategists, each one more unnerving than the last. Terran border stations had not gone offline, they had simply stopped broadcasting. Their signals were neither present nor absent. They existed in a strange null state the Council's analytic systems weren't programmed to decipher. Attempts to ping human outposts returned nothing but static that carried an unusual signature. It wasn't random noise. It was deliberate interference. Several counselors exchanged nervous glances. The reports disrupted their assumption that humans would scramble defensively. Instead of retreat, they were seeing precision maneuvers that didn't match any known military doctrine. The gravity readings from Terran space were shifting in patterns that suggested mass displacement on a colossal scale. Vessels with the tonnage of megacities were moving, but the Council's sensors weren't registering the fine details. The shadows of the fleet were there, then suddenly gone, as if a curtain had been pulled. One strategist activated a secure line. Confirm whether the Terran dreadnought classes are still in dock. A pause. Then a whisper. They vanished. The chamber's air changed instantly. Species that relied on pheromonal communication released chemical signatures of fear, confusing several diplomats who weren't accustomed to smelling dread in a place that usually radiated control. Relon's continued reading only amplified the tension. The casual rustle of paper sounded like a reminder that none of this surprised him. Grand Speaker Thalroth attempted to regain control. Explain your people's military movements, he demanded, voice rising in pitch. Your silence implies hostile intent. Relon didn't answer. He didn't even look up. He traced a column with his finger, as if checking on something trivial. The silence that followed was louder than an argument, drawing every gaze back to him. A representative from the Zalith Dominion leaned forward. Human, are you listening? Relon flipped the page. The analysts in the upper tier finally spoke, voices tight with unease. Our long-range arrays are detecting anomalous distortions near Council outer sectors. Not weapons. Not fleets. Something else. Another official checked telemetry. Gravity wells without mass signatures. A third whispered. That shouldn't be possible. Whispers grew sharper. Humans were known for ingenuity, but no one had suspected they possessed technology capable of hiding entire capital ships from gravitational detection. That was the kind of advancement civilizations achieved over millennia, not centuries. Relon sighed softly at something he read, almost bored. Interesting. His voice carried effortlessly across the amplifiers. Council stock prices dipped. The choice of topic rattled the chamber. The Council had just declared war, and the Terran Envoy was commenting on economics. That level of composure felt engineered, intentional, and confidently dismissive. A few counselors finally understood that the human wasn't ignoring them. He was signaling that their declaration hadn't moved the needle of his concern. Thalroth spoke again, this time more cautiously. Your fleets are repositioning. Your stations have gone silent. Your ships appear to be using masking capabilities beyond our records. Why act as if none of this matters? Relon lowered the paper a fraction, revealing eyes that carried none of the fear they expected. Because you made your declaration without understanding what you stepped into. Gasps echoed. It wasn't the words, it was the calm, the absence of threat, the tone of someone who had already accounted for every outcome. That kind of certainty was more alarming than aggression. A tactical officer blurted. Council ships in Sector 6 have been disabled. No casualties reported. Systems shut down simultaneously. Another added. Weapons deactivated. Drives offline. Even life support adjustments optimized. Humans boarded and left medkits. Confusion erupted everywhere. That wasn't conquest behavior. That was controlled dominance, a message rather than retaliation. Rel-Lan folded a corner of the newspaper neatly. We don't escalate without purpose, he said softly. But we don't wait for permission to prepare. More alerts flooded in. Terran vessels were appearing on the edges of Council systems, each one emerging from void-like distortions with perfect precision before vanishing again. The Council's best mathematicians couldn't even model the jumps. Every trace suggested a transit method that contradicted conventional physics. One conclusion rippled through the hall. The humans were already ahead of the war the Council thought it had just started. Rel-Lan turned another page. Ask yourself why you're surprised. He didn't raise his head, but the message was unmistakable. The Council had miscalculated. Horribly. The Envoy wasn't confident because he underestimated them. He was confident because he had already accounted for the entire conflict before they announced it. The chamber realized something chilling as another wave of updates poured in. Humanity wasn't responding to a war declaration. Humanity had already moved into position long before it was made. Council analysts attempted to regain control of the situation, but the flood of new combat updates overwhelmed their systems before they could even stabilize their voice channels. Every report from the front lines contradicted their expectations of an early war. There were no mass bombardments, no planetary losses, no human casualties. Instead, the data showed surgical precision, entire Council fleets immobilized without a single fatality, every system disabled simultaneously with an elegance that suggested humans had mapped those ships down to their smallest circuits. A transmission from the Vlar Armada flickered into the chamber. Their flagship hung lifeless in space, drifting with its engines offline. Crew members reported that Terran Marines appeared aboard without breaching hull plating. They materialized in controlled flashes of light, bypassing every form of shielding. Instead of conquest protocols, they offered medical supplies to the frightened Vlar crew, then vanished without taking prisoners or issuing demands. Even more unsettling was the message they left engraved in the bridge table: you attacked the wrong species. The Council had always believed humanity to be volatile, emotional, and reliant on brute industrial force. Yet the displays unfolding before them told the opposite story. Human ships operated as if they anticipated every variable. Dreadnoughts slipped into strikes with impossible coordination, disabling weapons arrays with subatomic accuracy. A carrier group reappeared near a Council stronghold long enough to shut down its defensive grid, then disappeared into folds of shimmering distortion that sensors couldn't track. One strategist, normally composed, dropped his stylus. They're not improvising, he whispered. They're executing a pre-calculated sequence. Another official analyzed the data feed. Look at their trajectories. They're moving entire fleets like a single organism. The realization shook the chamber. Humans weren't just strong, they were synchronized in a way ancient empires had never achieved. That level of coordination didn't arise from instinct. It came from preparation so deep that war felt like a pre-written plan rather than a reaction. Through it all, Rel-Lan continued reading the newspaper. He tilted it slightly to catch the light, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. The contrast between his stillness and the chaos in the chamber was so sharp that it felt intentional. The Council began to understand that his indifference wasn't a tactic. It was confidence built on certainty. A flicker of holographic blue appeared on several consoles. A new report: Council strike fleets along the perisphere line were neutralized in under 3 minutes. Not destroyed, neutralized. Drives locked, command links severed, life support stabilized. Every ship left in perfect condition. Human Marines aboard one vessel had even patched a cracked conduit before departing. The HFY truth hit several diplomats simultaneously. Humans weren't refusing to escalate out of moral posturing. They simply didn't need to. They had already demonstrated dominance by disabling an empire-wide military infrastructure without inflicting harm. That level of restraint was the clearest warning the Council had ever received. Rel-Lan finally lowered the newspaper half an inch. Your fleets aren't built for us, he said quietly. Ours aren't built for war, they're built for certainty. Before anyone could respond, another update blared across the chamber. Terran capital ships had reached Council inner territory without tripping a single defensive perimeter. It was impossible. Inner systems were protected by layers of early warning networks, gravitic tripwires, and psychic sentinels. Yet the human fleet bypassed all of it like a gust of wind passing through open doors. Council members visibly tensed. Their greatest military pride had been reduced to decorative infrastructure. One elder with crystalline skin murmured, "They walked through our defenses as if we drew them in sand." The next report delivered the final blow to Council confidence. Terran ships were broadcasting a single, repeating message across all channels, translated into every known language: stand down. We do not seek conquest, but we do not tolerate provocation. There was no threat embedded in the signal. No ultimatum. No countdown. Just certainty, delivered with calm precision. Relon folded the newspaper and rested it against his arm. "Humans don't fight because we enjoy conflict," he said. "We fight because we refuse to lose anything we've built." The chamber fell silent, absorbing the implications. Humanity hadn't responded to a war declaration with panic or retaliation. They had demonstrated that the Council's greatest fleets, weapons, and doctrines were irrelevant. They had already taken strategic high ground without firing a lethal shot. The Council finally understood that the Envoy's calm wasn't arrogance. It was mercy. Emergency sirens pulsed through the chamber as new strategic alerts spilled across the upper consoles. The Council's defensive web, an interconnected shield network that had stood unchallenged for 10,000 years, had just registered a single contact materializing at the edge of the capital's gravity well. Only one. No escorts, no formation lines, no fleet signatures. A solitary Terran vessel had appeared where no ship was supposed to breach without triggering layers of early warning fields. The analysts tried to isolate the reading. Their systems rejected the scan. The contact didn't match any known profile. Its mass estimate fluctuated wildly before stabilizing on a measurement so improbable that several counselors assumed it was an error, until the image resolved. A Terran superflagship hovered outside the capital world, a mobile fortress large enough to dwarf the orbital defense ring that wrapped the planet. Its presence alone nullified every assumption the Council had made about human limitations. Thalrotha's voice cracked as he demanded verification. His aides confirmed it. The ship wasn't cloaked. It wasn't hidden. It was simply there, unannounced, as if the distance between Terran space and the Council core were a casual stroll. The chamber's tension magnified as counselors recognized the implication. Humans had sent only one ship because they didn't require more. Inside the hall, Relon folded the newspaper across his knee, finally lifting his eyes with a calmness so measured it felt like a deliberate contrast to the chaos erupting around him. His expression held neither triumph nor hostility, only a tired disappointment. That unshaken demeanor carried more weight than the flagship outside. He allowed a quiet moment to settle before speaking in a tone that barely rose above normal conversation. "Humanity doesn't want war. But we don't lose them." Several species recoiled at the simplicity of the statement. It wasn't a threat. It was fact. The analysts frantically tried to re-establish a chain of command. The capital's orbital batteries attempted to lock onto the flagship, but every targeting system failed simultaneously. A council general shouted into a command link. "Their presence alone is scrambling our grids." Another added, "Our channels are being overridden, but without interference signatures. It's like they're stepping aside for incoming traffic." Relon rose from his platform, walking with quiet certainty toward the central podium. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous chamber, each one amplifying the council's unease. When he reached the podium, he gently placed the folded newspaper atop it, as if setting down a completed task. The gesture felt symbolic, a subtle announcement that the conversation had entered its final stage. A counselor regained enough composure to speak. "This is aggression. Your ships have violated restricted space." Relon met his gaze evenly. "Your declaration made everything unrestricted." Holographic displays lit up around the chamber. Live feeds from across the Council's territories flickered into view, disabled fleets drifting peacefully, weapons stations powered down, borders breached without violence. Not a single casualty report appeared. Terran precision had been absolute. Your people disabled our systems across multiple sectors, another counselor accused. Rellon nodded once. We prevented escalation. You declared war expecting fear. Instead, we made sure no one died while you reconsider. A crystalline elder trembled. Reconsider? Rellon tapped a command on his wrist device. The chamber's main projection shifted to a magnified view of the Terran flagship outside. Its hull shimmered with layered alloys that absorbed the sun's reflection, giving it a presence both serene and terrifying. A single ripple of blue light ran across its spine, an indication it was preparing for higher operational modes. You're looking at one ship, Rellon said softly. We didn't bring a fleet because we don't need one to make a point. A murmur spread across the hall as the gravity of those words settled. The chamber's bravest voices fell quiet. He stepped back from the podium. Withdraw the declaration. No conditions. No negotiations. Just withdraw it. The council erupted into disarray. Some argued for surrender. Others clung to pride, insisting a counterstrike must be possible. Their debate fractured into desperate fragments, revealing the unraveling confidence of an empire that had never faced a foe who didn't fear them. Through the spiraling voices, the flagship outside remained silent, unmoving, perfectly composed, mirroring the Envoy at its center. When the vote finally began, shaking hands activated their panels. The chamber doors sealed, leaving the echoes of fear, confusion, and reluctant clarity filling the air. And on the podium, the folded newspaper sat like a quiet reminder that the humans hadn't needed anger, intimidation, or theatrics. They had needed only certainty. The council chamber spiraled into frantic argument as the vote concluded, the results flashing across the central spire in cold, unforgiving clarity. A majority had chosen to withdraw the war declaration. A stubborn minority continued shouting objections, insisting the council's prestige demanded retaliation. Their voices were brittle, stripped of conviction, drowned beneath the weight of the data feeds still projecting Terran dominance across every sector. No one could pretend the situation was salvageable. Rellon remained still as the chaos unfolded. His eyes drifted to the folded newspaper resting on the podium, as if he were already thinking about returning to whatever article he'd been reading. The chamber door seals released with a deep mechanical hum, drawing every gaze toward the entrance as Terran honor guards stepped inside. They wore ceremonial armor, sleek, dark, and unarmed, yet their presence triggered an instinctive retreat across the assembly tiers. Even without weapons, they exuded the quiet assurance of soldiers who understood precisely what their civilization was capable of. One of the dissenting counselors pointed at them, voice cracking. This is coercion. An intimidation tactic. Rellon turned his head slightly. If we wanted intimidation, you'd know the difference. The honor guard halted behind him with perfect synchronicity, their formation precise enough to silence the remainder of the minority faction. Even the council's most arrogant members recognized what stood before them, representatives of a military force that had crossed the galactic core like it was a sidewalk. Thalroth, shaken and visibly older than he had seemed at the start of the day, addressed the envoy with humbled finality. The council retracts the declaration. Effective immediately. His voice wavered. What terms does Terra require? Rellon lifted the newspaper and tucked it under his arm. None. The single word left the chamber hollowed. Several counselors exchanged bewildered looks, unsure they had heard correctly. An empire expecting demands, territory, tribute, rearranged borders, found itself facing the opposite. No oversight, Rellon continued. No reparations. No diplomatic control structures. Leave humanity alone unless invited. That's it. The simplicity felt more destabilizing than any list of concessions. For millennia, the Council had only ever encountered younger species desperate for guidance or older species hungry for dominance. Humanity wanted neither. They sought nothing but autonomy. A crystalline elder raised a trembling hand. Why? With such strength, why not take advantage? Rellon regarded him with tired clarity. Because strength isn't meant for that. We built what we built to protect our own, not to rule the galaxy. He paused. You declared war thinking we were reckless. The truth is, we prefer peace. We just refuse to be cornered. The chamber absorbed the statement in uncomfortable silence. A concept unfamiliar to their politics took shape, restraint backed by overwhelming capability. It was not submission. It was choice. As Rellon prepared to leave, another counselor called out hesitantly. Envoy, the newspaper. What purpose did that serve? Rellon allowed himself a faint smile. To show you how little your declaration worried us. He tapped the folded pages lightly. War shouldn't begin with panic. If anything, it should begin with understanding. You didn't have any. We did. He stepped toward the exit as the honor guard followed, their movements smooth, deliberate, unthreatening yet absolute. The chamber doors parted, carrying the envoy's quiet confidence with them. Outside the capital world, the Terran super flagship shifted into slit veil mode. Its hull dissolved into shimmering distortion, and within seconds, the behemoth vanished entirely from Council sensors, not through stealth, but through mastery of physics beyond their reach. It departed without firing a single weapon. As the delegates watched the flagship disappear, a realization settled heavy across every tier. The humans had shown them mercy not out of weakness, but because they didn't consider the war worth their time. They had nothing to prove. Rellon reached the docking corridor where a Terran shuttle waited. I hope the restaurant's still open, he muttered to the pilot. I missed lunch for this. Back in the chamber, the Council's historians would later write that the day began with a war declaration but ended with something far more transformative. A lesson. You can intimidate many species in the galaxy, but never the ones who keep reading while you declare war.